Very good. We can now begin. This is all legal and actually happening. So get out, good afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you're viewing from. My name is Mark Mamagonian. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs for the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, NAASR. And on behalf of NAASR and the co-sponsor of today's program, this is the Society for Armenian Studies, SAS. I thank you for joining us. And I thank the SAS and its president, Barlo Der Mugadician, for collaborating with us as they have done on so many other programs. Let me remind you all who viewing that both NAASR and SAS, as two of the leading organizations that focus on the advancement of Armenian studies, rely on membership dues and donations to allow us to do our work. So please, if you are not yet, join the organizations and contribute as you are able to do so. Thank you. Furthermore, before we begin, I hope all who are watching today are safe and well, but I'm aware that some who may be with us today are in or near war zones, and we all hope that with the arrival of spring, perhaps peace and sanity can also arrive in areas where it is needed, which is to say, everywhere, if that's not asking too much. In the interest of time, I'm not going to announce some or all or any of the very, very many events coming up which NAASR is organizing or co-sponsoring. I will only encourage you to get on our email list, follow us on social media, visit our website, all of the things that one does to keep track of happenings in the world. The same, of course, holds true for SAS. Now, we will get on with things. I'm very excited about today's presentation because we have two superb scholars with us who are the editors of an important new publication, Medieval Yeghegis, Armenia, History, Archaeology, Society, Local Multiplicities and Global Connections of a Rural Center on the Silk Road, open parentheses, close parentheses. Recently issued by Brepols, and happily this rich volume is available online through the publisher as an open access publication, so you can find it and read it on your own free of charge. And it's also available in physical form and will be added very soon to the NAASR bookstore, for instance. And if you are like me and you need to have a book in your hands, you can purchase it from us or elsewhere. And on a personal note, lastly, I'm pleased because just last summer, as I was telling our friends earlier, I was fortunate enough to visit some of the amazing sites in Vayots Dzor that are discussed in the book, including the Zorats Church, which gives the book and our lecture today its sort of defining image. So let me briefly introduce our speakers, Zaroui Pogossian and Michele Nucciotti. Dr. Zaroui Pogossian is a specialist in medieval Armenian history, culture, and religion, especially in relation to other peoples, cultures, and religions in the Near East and Asia Minor. She is Associate Professor of Byzantine Civilization at the University of Florence and the PI, which I'm almost sure is primary investigator as opposed to private investigator, of the ERC project ARM and Armenia Entangled, Connectivity and Cultural Encounters in Medieval Eurasia, 9th to 14th centuries. This is a large and important ongoing project. Dr. Michele Nucciotti is an associate professor of medieval archaeology and senior researcher at the University of Florence. Since 2000, he has led archaeological projects in Amiata, Petra, Shalbach in Jordan, and Armenia, collaborating with institutions such as the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the European Union. So I now place the program squarely in the hands of our two scholars, and I believe, Zara, you are first. And don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. It's actually principal investigator, but you
Principal.
were right. Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction, and I'm really glad to be here. And I would like to thank the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, which I visited in the last century, something around 1996 or 7. So it's time to come back. So thank you for providing us this opportunity to present the book. And I will share my presentation with the viewers, so they also have some visual images. So as Mark rightly fully read the title, it's actually a long Victorian title, but it does justice to what we have tried to do in this book. Already citing history, archaeology, society shows that our purpose had been to approach the history of Yeghegis, this very special village, a small village today in Armenia, from an interdisciplinary perspective on the one hand, so combining research into historical written sources, archaeological sources, so material culture that is very important for this village, and trying to understand how the society was built, how it functioned. And the subtitle, Local Multiplicities and Global Connections, are actually relevant to how this society worked first in the Middle Ages on a very local level, the relationship between different members of this society, different classes of this society, to the regional power holders, but also to global power holders, and we will see who these are. And of course, the last concept, the Silk Roads, is a concept very much debated in the last years, but it also points in this connection of the title to the importance of trade and trade networks, communication networks for any research really, but specifically for this village, and we will see more how it was expressed. So how did this all start? I hope you see my screen without, okay. Okay, so how did this all start? Actually, it started while I was working on a project sponsored by the European Commission, the European Research Council, called Jews East, whose purpose was to study the relationship between Jews and Christians in the East. So from the Eastern Mediterranean all the way to the Indian Ocean, in an effort to overcome Eurocentric biases in this type of research and also see the interaction between these religious communities in situations where Christians were not necessarily the ruling majority. So we studied Ethiopia, various parts of the Middle East, also the Caucasus and India. So from there rose my interest regarding this village, Yeghegis, because it has a Jewish cemetery, a medieval Jewish cemetery, graves with inscriptions, which is a very important historical and archaeological source. So then I discovered, I did not know yet at that time when I started being interested in this village, I didn't know my colleague Michele Nucciotti, with whom we have since been collaborating very closely. Then I discovered that they had been working in the region of Vayots Dzor, together with colleagues from the Yerevan State University, Professor Hamlet Petrosyan, Yerevan State University, and the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography of Armenia. So we spoke, it just happened that Professor Petrosyan was in Italy, so we even met in person. This was all before COVID, and it was more common to meet people in person. Now we do have the advantage of meeting online, but it was more fun when you met together and had lunch and drank together. I mean, this happens even now. So we discussed our common interests and decided to plan a trip to this village of Yeghegis in 2018. So here on this slide, you see, let me turn on the pointer. So on this slide, you see an inscription from one of the graves, a view to the graves in the Jewish cemetery. But what you see on the left are many more monuments that we, of course, went on to study, because you can never study one thing isolated from the rest of its context. So in order to understand why there was a Jewish cemetery there, which is really a unique site in historical Armenia, we needed to understand what else was going on there, what other monuments were there, what was the relationship as in terms of time as well as in terms of space. So the end result, of course, is the volume. And before I discuss the content of the volume, I really would like to emphasize that this book is the result of teamwork. The teamwork, as I said, started together in 2018. So you see us both in working situations. In the background is a caravanserai, a very famous caravanserai, but also a meeting at the end of the day to discuss what we have seen, analyze the evidence we had recovered, or even just having fun while studying a monument, the famous or iconic Zorat's church. And it's one thing to do field work, but again, of course, when we come back to our universities, to our offices, it's a long work after teamwork, after field work, putting together the data collected, doing research, bibliographical research into primary sources and secondary sources. So hence, it's not immediate that what you excavate comes out immediately with a wonderful result. So it takes time. Now, the content of the book, I hope you can see it. Maybe it's a bit small, but that means that you really need to get the book and read it closely, having the opportunity to peruse all the pages. The way we structured is, as I said, we combined different methodological tools, different approaches to research. We start with research on the history of the village and the region. This village is in the region of Vayots Dzor, which is today a Mars or a province of Armenia. This Vayots Dzor was part of a larger region known as Syunik. So Gavar was Vayots Dzor in the medieval sources, and Syunik is Nahang of Syunik. So the first two chapters are dedicated to the history of Syunik, doing a longue durée kind of overview from the 9th to 14th century, then trying to combine to look at what cultural heritage there is in Syunik, in this village of Vayots Yeghegis, from the point of view of historical sources. What do historical sources tell us? What other information we can get, and to understand what happened, why was there a boom in the 13th and 14th century, a construction boom in Yeghegis, which we call the golden age of Yeghegis. So the second half of the 13th and the first half of the 14th centuries. So these chapters are by me. Then Michele Nucciotti provides some preliminary theoretical concepts that lead to the study of the monuments from an archaeological perspective. And it is the first time that these monuments have been subject not to simply art historical analysis, which have been carried out also in the past, but to archaeological analysis, such as reading the walls as historical evidence. But I will not go into great detail into it because my colleague Michele Nucciotti will do that. Then our authors who studied the specific monuments, Leonardo Squilloni, Francesca Kelly, Marianna De Falco, and Diletta Biggiotti, who I hope are among the people listening to us, studied each monument separately and have dedicated chapters to the specific monuments. Our colleague Elisa Bruno, so what you need something to build these monuments, most importantly stone. So another groundbreaking study by Elisa Bruno studied how this stone was quarried and brought to the sites and how the production was organized. Tatiana Vartanesova from Yerevan State University and the Institute of Archaeology in Yerevan traced the Silk Road via the artifacts, so ceramics that have been found in Yeghegis. Many of them are in the Yeghegna Dzor Regional Museum. Then we have two articles, actually three, who look at the epigraphic evidence. So Michael Pfeiffer, who may be also among the audience, studied another unique monument from Yeghegis. It's trilingual, a grave with a trilingual inscription, looking at it from a historical, topographical, and cultural interactions perspective. And the same was done by Alexandra Koffel regarding the Jewish cemetery, where she did some new interpretations of the inscriptions and tried to find parallels with other evidence of Jewish settlement and cemeteries in the Eastern realm, so in West and East Asia. And of course, okay, so with Professor Hamlet Petrosyan and myself, we published all the inscriptions within Armenian inscriptions within the village of Yeghegis and in the surrounding areas. All three chapters dedicated to the inscriptions also have translations of these inscriptions into English. And the book concludes with Vasco La Salvia's conclusions, which bring together all the chapters. So I will go a little bit into the historical chapters which I authored, but for us, for me, for all of us, maps are very important to give you an idea. So Yeghegis is south of Lake Sevan in the region of Vayots Dzor in Armenia. You see it on a contemporary map. In a map of historical provinces of Armenia, it was part of Syunik. So this one of the largest provinces of historical Armenia. Yeghegis and the Vayots Dzor region are south of Lake Sevan. And again, on a bigger regional map of the time period. So these are major cities, medieval centers of trade and power, so central places. Yeghegis is not too distant from Dvin. Dvin is probably the most important large center not far from it. But it's not too far also from Tabriz, which was the capital of the Mongol Empire known as the Ilkhanate, so an offshoot of the big Mongol Empire. And it's not from Partav or Barda in the Arabic sources. And indeed, part of why it flourished in 9th, 10th, and then again 13th, 14th centuries especially, was its closeness to a section of the Silk Road which went from Dvin to Partav. So along the valley of the river Araxes, and we will see a very important caravanserai, but there were more than one caravanserai in the region of Vayots Dzor, which is something very unique to have such a concentration of receptive structures that are able to have travelers, trading caravans so nearby to each other. So that's also one of the unique features of this landscape. Now, if we zoom in into the region of Syunik, Syunik is one of these mountainous highlands in the larger Armenian highland, the Armenian plateau. So it dominates the plain of the river Arax. So we had the historical province of Sharur, now the exclave of Nakhichevan. So it dominates that lowlands which are to its west, and then to its east was the region of Artsakh, another mountainous region. As you can see, the green parts are where the communication roads were, of course. So very important both for trade, but also for war. You know, you use the same routes for traveling. So strategically, Syunik or areas of Syunik, fortresses of Syunik could control communication routes. So they were very important for the control of territory. As any polity or formation in the Middle Ages, Syunik's borders also changed very much. You saw in the earlier map, I can actually go back and show you, Syunik went all the way, you know, the entire basin of Lake Sevan was part of the province of Syunik. However, in the 9th century and the beginning of 10th, as the Bagratids became stronger, the Bagratid kingdom of Armenia with their center in Ani, they slowly annexed the part of Syunik that was known as Gerarkunik, so all around Lake Sevan. At the beginning of the 11th century, they also annexed Vayots Dzor. Well, basically, that was a dowry of a Sunni princess who was married to King Gagik I. Her name was Katranide, and she's very famous for finishing the construction of the Cathedral of Ani. So, besides constructing that cathedral, she also brought as her dowry Vayots Dzor to her husband Gagik I. And after the death of her father, this region passed under Bagratid control, and we have also material cultural evidence for it. So the Sunni stronghold moved to the south east of the territory, and we will see it in another map, where there was a kingdom of Sunni founded. So I said Sunnis are a big ramified family. I don't know how well you see this genealogical tree, but again, if you access the book either online or in a physical copy, all of this is there. So these are the Sunnis who became the branch of the Sunnis who became a kingdom with their center in Bakh or in Kapan, so in the southeastern part of Sunik. They intermarried with nobility from Artsakh, and so it's very interesting, and you can read the details, that the passage of power, the succession, was not always done through the male line, but also through the female line, either through a daughter who then married somebody else, and then the sons of this daughter, or through a sister. So another very interesting feature of these dynastic processes in Sunik. Some important changes take place in Vayots Dzor. As I said, it passed to Bagratid control around 1003. However, as we all know, the Bagratid kingdom was annexed to the Byzantine Empire in 1045. Presumably also Vayots Dzor became part of Byzantine Empire, but this very brief period is not well understood. It would be the easternmost area of the Byzantine Empire. Of course, it would be important for the control of communication routes to Dvin, which was a major trading hub and a very important center. So we don't really know much. We don't really know if Byzantium established actual control of this territory. What we know, we get more information since the Seljuk conquests of Armenia. So the region of Kapan, so the kingdom of Bakh, so was here. You see my pointer, I hope, is the last to fall. Its king manages to come to an agreement with Melik Shah, a very important Seljuk sultan, and it's only after the death of Melik Shah that there is a very, very slow conquest of this region by the Seljuks. And I said this is a highly mountainous area, which means high mountains, deep valleys, very hard to control, a territory that is hard to control. So it takes about 70 years to conquer all the fortresses of Vayots Dzor. And we are informed about this by one of the most important medieval Armenian historians, Stepanos Orbelian, who wrote the history of this region. However, one bishop, whose name was Hovannes, after the conquest of the kingdom of Sunik, he was from Bakh, or from Kapan, actually, Hovannes of Kapan. He wanders around, and eventually settles in the valley of this river known as Gnishik, and builds a small, re-establishes like a monastic community here. You can read, it says Noravank, literally Noravank in Armenian means new monastery. What you see is the spectacular final complex of the Noravank monastery. These buildings, most of them are from the end of the 13th or 14th century. When Hovannes of Kapan settles there at the beginning of the 12th, there were only two small chapels, but he is able, through very intelligent maneuvering, and discussions and negotiations with the Seljuk court, which was at that time in Isfahan, to acquire a special status for this area, for his monastery and the estates that the monastery controlled. And we can say that the second flourishing period of Vayots Dzor and Yeghegis is due to these efforts of of Hovhannes. Before I go on, let me mention that Yeghegis was actually, I go back with a map, you see Yeghegis here in Sambata were also the seat of the senior branch of the Sunni princes. So before even the formation of the Kingdom of Sunik, Yeghegis was an important central place. And I believe my colleague Michele Nucciotti will speak about one small church that is still found there, founded at the end of the 9th century, probably one of the earliest efforts to shape the landscape by the Sunni nobility. Of course, there is a very large cathedral also, which is dated to the 17th century, but built on older foundations. And it is possible that in the 10th century, there was this very important large cathedral as well. So Yeghegis was already an important place, but as I said, due to Seljuk conquest, the gravity of the center of gravity moved to southeastern Sunik. And it is thanks to the efforts of Hovhannes of Kapan, to the Bishop Hovhannes of Kapan, that Vayots Dzor again becomes an important location, again sort of starts its revival. The greatest, brightest period of Vayots Dzor and parts of Sunik is due to the nobles known as Orbelians and Proshans. Vayots Dzor, especially the Orbelians. Who are they and how did they appear in Sunik? So just to show you on this map, you can see the Orbelian domains and monuments in green and those of Proshans in violet. So you see how they are interlocked. And we will see what this means in terms of social relations, military relations, and political relations. So a huge family, this established in this region of Armenia from Georgia, and I will say why, at the end of the 12th century, and you see the branches of the family which ruled Sunik all the way to the 15th century with, of course, changes. You know, their high point is the end of the 13th and the first half of the 14th century, from when we have the vast majority of monuments, but they keep their rule of Sunik until the middle of the 15th century, and even later there are small branches of the family surviving, not as potent rulers as they were earlier, but they are one of these very long families in late medieval or early modern period Armenia. Now, the Orbelians come to this part of Armenia originally from Georgia. They are a Georgian family, also intermarried with the Armenian Bagratids. Their domains were not far from Petania. Their graves were in this, not far from Tbilisi. Their name comes from their fortress, which was Orbet. So Orbeli means those from the fortress of Orbet. They become so strong that they rebel against the Georgian Bagratid king, Georgi III. They lose this, they try to unify various Georgian nobles to their cause. They probably wanted to establish sort of an independent principality, perhaps with its seat in Ani, and perhaps it's not by coincidence that they married into the Bagratids of Lori in Armenia. So they did have connections to Armenia already, but their rebellion was crushed. So they flee to the Seljuks, to the Chamberlains, so-called Atabek in the terminology. So the Atabek means the tutor of the son of the Sultan. And their name was Ildiguzid, Ildenizids. There are different ways of naming it. In the Armenian sources, they are Eldiguzids. So these Orbelians, these two Orbelian brothers, enlist in the service of the Eldiguzids. But at some point, one of them, so this guy whose name was Yelikum, who dies around 1195, he is given some land near Nakhichevan, some shops in Nakhichevan, And then eventually he marries a woman. As you see here, the importance of local connections. You know, he was nobody in that region, so he needed people to support him. He needed some local connections. He marries the sister of the local bishop. Her name was Khatun. And from this marriage, then we can say start the Armenian Orbelians. Eligum dies when his son Liparit, which we can say he is the actual founder of the Armenian Orbelian, was a young child. We are told that he was held as a hostage by the second husband or somebody who had kidnapped her mother. It's not very clear in our source. He had to run away. And thanks to his mother's connection, so Khatun's brother, who was Bishop Stepanos, he was able to come and establish himself, surprise, surprise, in Vayots Dzor. So his mother had connections. So Liparit is the son of Khatun. Through these connections, he's able to consolidate his power in Vayots Dzor. So I have again the monument of Noravang, because slowly, so he builds his network of connections. He is enlisted by the strong lords of northern Armenia, which are the Zakharids, who are actually the generals of the Georgian army, of the Georgian Pagratids. So he's able to consolidate his rule. And of course, very important for the consolidation of his rule is also the shaping of the landscape, the patronage of holy sites, patronage of holy relics. So he builds a new church dedicated to near Subkarapet, dedicated to Saint Stephen. And another bishop of this region is actually his cousin, Bishop Sarkis, because he was, again, the son of his mother's sister, so his maternal cousin. You see how important it was that his father had married a local woman. So together with Bishop Sarkis, they managed also to deposit a true cross relic in that church, which is an extremely important holy object, and an object that also legitimized his connection to this territory, his connection to the very important holy site in this territory. There's a very long story how this relic gets there, so I suggest people reading it in the chapter dedicated to it. It's very interesting, also involves sort of a multi-religious court who adjudicate who should this true relic go to. And in this court, the participants or the judges were heads of the monasteries of both Armenia and Georgia, the Qadi of Dvin, so the Muslim judge of Dvin, as well as another sheikh, a Muslim sheikh of the region. So very, very interesting from the point of view of social relations and interreligious relations in this period. So the Orbelians slowly consolidate their rule. They found monasteries as part of their strategy of territory control. Their rivals in the 13th and 14th century are the Prussian princes. So as I said, all what you see in violet are the Prussians, and here is yet another family tree of the Prussians. Why do Orbelians manage to come out, I don't want to say victorious, but as the strongest rulers of Vayots Dzor? So we saw how Orbelians came from very troubled beginnings, a rebellion, a crushed rebellion. They had to build from scratch their relationships in Sunik. So whatever they gained, whatever territory they were able to control, it was very dear to them because that's what they had. The Prussians came from Artsakh, from the actual, so the territory of Khachen in Artsakh. They had excellent relationships with the Zakharids. Their territories went beyond Sunik. Actually, they controlled also the monastery of Kecharis, so it's east of Lake Sevan. Many of you probably who listen to us probably have visited Gerard, that amazing site that became then another dynastic cemetery of the Prussians. So they had territories in different parts of Armenia, not just in Sunik. So this meant that perhaps They were not as tenacious as becoming or did not succeed to become the strongest rulers of the Sunni, at least at the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century. But there can also be the problem of sources. As I said, we have Stepanos Orbelian's history of the region of Syunik, which is dedicated to his family. His last name already shows Stepanos Orbelian. He was from the Sunni family. He was the son of Tarsaic Orbelian. So I put the first two important princes, without whom the Orbelians would not enjoy this huge flourishing. Sambat Orbelian and Tarsaic Orbelian, they rule in the middle of the 13th century, and their rule corresponds with Prosh Khakbakian. So then the family takes the name of Proshan because this Prosh Khakbakian was so important as the founding father of the Khakbakians in Syunik. So we don't have a family history of Proshans. Both Orbelians and Khakbakians fight for the new power that establishes itself on a vast global scale, the Mongol Empire. They fight in the Mongol armies. I will a little bit talk more about the Mongols, but I cannot monopolize the time, so I will get into it a little bit. Both of them had excellent relations with the Ilkhanids. We know, of course, a lot more about Sambat Orbelian and then his brother Tarsaic Orbelian. We know that Sambat Orbelian went at least twice to Karakorum. So you see, these families were very, very mobile on a global scale. He went to Tabriz. He was in constant contact with them. Stepanos Orbelian tells us that Sambat spoke 6 languages, among them Uyghur and the Mongol language, Persian, of course, Turkish, Armenian, and possibly also Georgian. We don't have these details about Prosh Khakbakian, but we presume he did not in any way lag behind his rival Sambat Orbelian. But we have other evidence, such as from colophons, inscriptions, that he also was a patron of the arts. For example, we have acts of the council in Zagavan, which was called in 1280, where Prosh Khakbakian is one of the first in the list. So he appears before Tarsaic Orbelian. Then he is known for a very, very important foundation, the foundation of the University of Glazor, which was a flourishing center of arts, culture, study of philosophy, translations, production of philosophical works. We don't know exactly where the University of Glazor was located, and I have a long section in that chapter mentioning some new hypotheses that it was not far from the village of Yeghegis, which is very interesting, which would really mean that these two families were competing with each other for the control of that territory, because Yeghegis became another central seat of the Orbelian family. This is called Tarabas, or the gate, or the divan. So they had two. Let me see if I have a map. Okay, so let me show you on the map. The first was in Arpa, which is not far from the monastery of Noravank, which I showed. And then Yeghegis, which was already, I said, in the 9th and 10th centuries, a seat of power of Sunni princes, becomes also a center of Orbelians. So all the buildings we see in Yeghegis, except for the 9th century church, date from that period. So Yeghegis becomes a center of power. And if the monastery of Glazor was not too far, it's localized somewhere here. But again, this is just a hypothesis. That means that Prosh Khakbakian was also a very smart ruler and said, look, you can't just expand. The whole of Syunik is not yours. We are also here. And here in violet, you see various monasteries which they founded, which they sponsored, and which indicate that they were very much present as well. And on this occasion, let me highlight how important it is to work with different kinds of historical sources, both written and material, cultural, archaeological, because we get very different types of evidence on history. They may compete each other. Sometimes they tell completely different stories, but often they compete each other and they allow us to have a more complete picture of what was going on. So in the rest of this presentation, I will just show you wonderful photos and wonderful pictures and leave the reading, the detailed reading of the chapters. Otherwise, I will spoil your reading of the book. Just to show you why it is important, why to control this territory and certain points in this territory. This is a view from Sambataber, so a fortress, to Yeghegis. So on the one side you saw Yeghegis, on the other side you saw another village, and of course also you controlled communication routes and hence trade. And this is a view on the right, a view from this famous Zorat church, which is kind of an iconic church for Yeghegis. A very important component for the wealth of the Orbelians was trade. And here is our team in front of the caravanserai of Selim, about which our team members have produced various works, various articles, not all of them in this volume, but you can easily find these and also read and see how our project has contributed not only to this volume but beyond. Yeghegis was a place of multiple religious encounters. I mentioned at the very beginning the Jewish cemetery, so this is yet another gravestone, inscribed gravestone from the Jewish cemetery with Hebrew inscriptions. But we also have a very interesting trilingual inscription on which Michael Pfeiffer wrote a wonderful article in this collection. What these texts say. What does the Armenian say? What does the Persian and what does the Arabic inscription say? And they're very, very different. And clearly they appeal to different readers with different expectations. So I let you read this in the book as well. But it is very important to understand that this small village was, we can say, a cosmopolitan place. Cosmopolitan in the sense that many languages, people of different faiths either lived there or passed through. And the Orbelians and Proshans were patrons of arts and culture. Here we see Tarsaïd Orbelian, whom I mentioned, so the third ruler in Vayots Dzor, and his wife Mina Khatun. This stone is lost, only the lower part is still extant. Who knows, we may still find it, but it was photographed at the beginning of the 20th century in the village of Yeghegis. And the photo is now in the archives of the History Museum of Armenia, whom I thank for having allowed us to publish this. And on your right, you see a headpiece from a manuscript, famous Gospel of Gladzor, so in the monastery of Gladzor, which I said, which was founded by the Proshans. So these families, their rivalry also meant that we can enjoy great art, because they showed off also by their foundations. Other objects that have been studied that we owe to them is the Zorat church, about which maybe Michele will speak, and the reliquary of a true cross of Chotakerat, an amazing work of art, of silver smith's art with a very detailed inscription. It's very interesting that the sponsor of this reliquary is Eachi Proshan, and he also kind of connects these two families together because he was married into the Orbelian family. So we see how, okay, you're rivals, but at some point you also decide maybe it's easier to get married and unify the wealth of both families. Again, a gospel produced in Gladzor by produced in Gladzor, and an inscription from the wall of the Zorat church, Boros Taronatsi, sorry, the name had somehow escaped me for that minute. And the whole village is really full of monuments, like monumental khachkars in a private garden. So it's really an amazing place to visit and to enjoy. And I hope I didn't go way beyond my time. So I thank everybody for attention, and I pass the word to my colleague.
Zara, thank you. And while Michele is setting up his PowerPoint, I should mention, as I neglected to do at the beginning, that audience members, of course, can use the Zoom Q&A to submit questions. And following Michele's presentation, we will entertain those.
May I start? Thank you. Well, thank you very much.
Michele, we're not seeing the right window. We're seeing.
Okay. Let me see.
That's better.
Okay. Can you see it now?
Good.
Well, I want to thank very much Mark and Nasser. I'm really glad to be here with Zara, and thank you very much for having us in presenting this volume that, as Zara already said, is a real teamwork because so many people actually were necessary to analyze and then to interpret the historical sources, both, I mean, the written one, and for, I mean, this part of the presentation, I will speak specifically of the material sources. So these are two shots from seasons 2014 and 2015. That were the first two seasons of the archaeological mission, the making of the Silk Roads in Vayots Dzor. Then we changed the name into the making of the Silk Roads in Armenia. And it was the first occasion for me to have an encounter with the materiality of Vayots Dzor after experiences that I had in previous research in Jordan and in Italy. And I must say a strong connection with Armenia, thanks to Ruben Galisham, whom I met when I was a student in London and in the 1990s. And really, I see him as my starting point for the interest in Armenia. But this interest later developed, especially thanks to Zara. So I will go into a presentation of how we made this building speak the language of archaeology, and how we then interpreted these buildings in the area of Yeghegis in a historical perspective. First of all, well, I can add nothing to what Zara presented, because her work on historical sources in Vayots Dzor is really a groundbreaking one. And as she said, sometimes written and material sources speak different languages. Sometimes they say different things. But sometimes, even if different, this difference can be seen as different perspectives on the same subject. So our research, the one on the written sources and the one on the material sources, was largely from the point of view of data collection and also of interpretation, like two lines of independent research. And then we tried to put them together, and we found that some findings that were clear from the written sources could be also perceived from the material one. And this, I mean, for me, represent one of the great values of this volume and of our work. So from my point of view, the material history of Yeghegis area is also a history of two valleys. Then in the conclusion of my presentation, I will explain clearly why. So these two valleys are the valley of Selim, that connects like Selim to Arpa Areni, and the other one is the valley of Yeghegis, which is a side valley to this major valley coming down from Selim. How could we like transform material architecture, especially architectures, into archaeological objects? We use this method called light archaeology, which is a non-destructive way of extracting stratigraphy from buildings. Normally, stratigraphy for archaeologists is a matter of excavation, and still is even for us, where we are now working on the site of Dvin. But if we consider an architecture as like a special type of a material object that was stratified over the years and sometimes underwent destructions and reconstructions, etc., we can read buildings not from an art historical or architectural historical point of view, but as archaeological objects. So basically, we started building these very simple material biographies of our architectural objects. And then we started tracing connections between them and the territory, and finally, with integration with written and epigraphic sources. In the area of Yeghegis, we worked on several sites, as Zara already mentioned. One of them is the Arates Monastery. The other one is the caravanserai of Selim, which by far is, and justly, is the most famous of present-day Armenia, also for its fantastic state of preservation, and also for the importance, both in terms of architecture and also historical, of this presence along this strand of the Silk Road that crosses the area of Yeghegis, not passing directly into the Yeghegis village, but actually going from the Selim Pass to the Selim Caravanserai and a series of other caravans, some of which are lost today, but one of which is still present. Downhill from Selim is the caravanserai of Vayots Dzor, and this branch of the Silk Road then goes towards Arpa Areni, that, as Zara already mentioned, was the first central place that the Orbelian used to manage the territory, and from a political, economic, and also symbolic point of view. Another site that we investigated is a fortress, Sambataper fortress, actually laying on the ridge between Yeghegis and Valley of Selim. And also we found another fortress, but this is inside Yeghegis. This is a map of the village. As you can see from the red dots that actually point to sites and historical building, Yeghegis really represents a very dense area of investment of aristocratic sponsors, especially in the Middle Ages, and this frequency and this density already makes it clear that despite Yeghegis never becomes a city, even in the Middle Ages, it is by far the most important central place of medieval Vayots Dzor. So, going into the monuments in Yeghegis, I'd like to mention the old church, what we call the old church, actually, because we don't know the dedication of this church, which is a very simple construction, like single nave, single apse, just two bays, very small building, that actually which bears a very important inscription that is for the first time published in our volume. It was read originally by colleague Hamlet Petrosian. This inscription tells the story of a donor of the stone used to build this church in the year 851. So exactly in the same years where the Siuni princes moved to Yeghegis and actually formed the first, let's say, symbolic space of Yeghegis as a royal or princely seat, which is the, let's say, the mark of this site and its history, that connects this Sioni phase also with the golden age of Yeghegis under the Orbelians. This is an analysis of the old church, but I will not go too much into this detail. What I want to point out is that in the same years, the same Sioni built another church in the same area, which is the oldest church of the Arates monastery complex, and the church of San Sion. Actually, they are both single nave, single apse churches, and so probably, especially, let's say, in the area of Vayots Dzor, maybe this type of building was also like a type of landmarking that the Sioni dynasty adopted in order to mark the landscape with architectural presences and symbols that would actually connect these buildings to their sponsorship. And the shape of churches is something we have pretty much considered or reflected on, because the situation changes completely with the integration of Yeghegis and Vayots Dzor into the Bagratid kingdom. What happened in our area? Well, for the first time, we have an appearance of a new type of church, with a cupola church, and we have two of them connected to the Bagratid sponsorship and dated to the 11th century. They are the Church of Santa Svatsatsin, again in Arates, so there is a connection between the new royals, well, really royals in the case of the Bagratid, and the location chose by the Sioni in the previous period for their investment and for the foundation of the monastery of Arates. And the second cupola church of Bagratid period is in the monastery of Zagatskar, and is the church of Surp Karapet. So these churches are very important because they bring directly into Yeghegis area the typical style of the capital of the Bagratid kingdom, Ani. So it's really like an architectural, let's say, revolution. But also there's from the typological point of view, these cupola churches were possibly, let's say, used as antecedents to be imitated as archetypes by the Orbelians, because when the Orbelians established their palaces in Arpa and in Yeghegis, they built two cupola churches in these two villages, global villages. And of course, like, imagine local residents that for years and years have visited Zagatskar or Arates and were used to connect these cupola churches with the Bagratids, also because these churches have inscriptions, for instance, the church of Surp Karapet in Zagatskar. At a certain point, they found cupola churches in their village, especially in Yeghegis. So this connection, in a way, should have been part, I think, of the public discourse that the Orbelian directed towards the local residents, in a way. So it may stress, in my opinion, a connection that the Orbelian willingly searched with the Bagratids. By the way, Stepanos Orbelian, the historian and bishop, to whom Zara already referred in her presentation, in his history mentions twice the like an possible origin of the Orbelian. In the first mention, like the Orbelians are said to be connected to the Bagratid. So in a way, we see with this architecture the reuse of cupola church that in the area had been introduced by the Bagratid as a material statement that couples more or less the statement of Stepanos Orbelian. For the cupola church, here we see some stratigraphy, but what is this stratigraphy useful for? Of course, for distinguishing restoration and several phases of, let's say, building and rebuilding of the same church. But we actually worked also with microstratigraphy, and you can see on the left the reconstruction of the building yard. So we mapped the way in which the team of builders in the 13th century moved around the building yard and what were the bits of the church that were constructed and in which sequence. And this is relevant because, of course, also the way in which a building yard is organized is part of this non-material knowledge of medieval builders that is not recorded in written sources and that can only be traced through, in this case, through light archaeology. The same is also true for Zorat's church, a very special monument attributed. I mean, also I agree with this attribution to Burdel Orbelian. This is a building of 14th century. And on Zorat, actually, with light archaeology, we investigated also the fortification ring around the church. And our conclusion is that this fortification ring predates the church and may well be like a fortification in itself, maybe in its ancient phases, most ancient phases, dating to the Sunni period. So if we didn't do excavation, I mean, in the eastern part of the site where we have evidence of the most ancient walls, but in this case, I mean, if this were proved in the future, it may be a further point on the willing connection that the Orbelian search with the previous royal or princely houses active in Vayots Dzor. Here we see to the right the sequence of construction, so like a similar biography or diary of the building site of the church in the 14th century. But in front of the church, we see this wall B9 and then B11, which is made not of perfectly squared stones and finely dressed stones, but with like coarse stones, sometimes organized not really in horizontal courses. And we reflected on this type of technology. And as I mentioned before, we reconstructed quite a long sequence of this type of local technologies that possibly we think that this is like the traditional longue durée technical knowledge related to building that was already present in Vayots Dzor, maybe already before the Sunni, certainly before the Orbelian. And so this let's say, division between very beautiful masonries and public buildings and spectacular monuments, and this type of very simple masonry technology, in a way helped us to divide the local society between local residents, communities that have been there maybe for centuries and centuries, and then ruling elites that, especially from the 9th century onwards, then incorporated this land into states or policies or princedom, etc. So to build, let's say, a dialogue between these two dimensions. Another aspect that we investigated, especially in relation to Yeghegis cemetery, is the connection between the Jewish cemetery and the Christian cemeteries of this area. We did that by microstratigraphy and analyzing the traces of the tools that were used to actually cut and model the tombstone on one side, and those used for drawing the inscriptions. In this case, we see that while the tombstones show exactly the same technology for Christians and Jewish communities, the tools used for writing the inscription differ very much, especially like in the inscriptions of the so-called Orbelian cemetery. We have the use of this flat blade that create a script that is really epigraphic, really monumental, while to the right we see a Jewish inscription that is, well, it's quite, let's say, it's a good example, let's say, of the other inscriptions that we have in the Jewish cemetery, and it is realized with a pointed tool. So we imagine that there is like a workshop locally that produces the tombstone, and then let's say the cultural marking in case of the Jewish cemetery is done within and by the Jewish community with less specialized tools than the ones used for the, say, most important inscriptions that we see in the Orbelian cemetery. Also, thanks to the work of Michael Stone, the revision by Alexandra Haffel, we had some very well dated tombstones in the Jewish cemetery, and comparing the tools used in for the finishing of these tombs with the tools used in our upstanding churches, we were able to date the cupola church to probably, like most likely, around 1270, and this is also like a result. What's left? Well, we spoke basically about churches, but churches are not the only buildings that were realized in the Vayots Dzor in the area of Yeghegis during the Middle Ages, because it was also a very important trade location and very important political location. From written sources, we know that the Orbelian had palaces or dara passes or diwans, both in Areni and also in Yeghegis. Unfortunately, we have, I mean, we only have some scattered materials like the lunette with the bas relief that Zara showed, but for the Palace of Yeghegis, and in recent excavation in Areni by Dr. Franklin, it was hypothesized that near the church of near the church of Areni, like the church built by Monique, were reused ashlars from the Orbelian Palace. So we have some idea of the location of these two palaces within these two villages, but we don't have any actual structure of these two palaces. We have a whole of a palace belonging to the Orbelian, in this case Cesar Orbelian, in the village of Horts. And looking at the plan, we can see that we have like a peculiar recess just opposite to the entrance of this hall that resembles like an E1 or a raised platform with an E1. And we have the same type of architectural composition also in the main hall of the Selim Caravanserai. And E1, we know, I mean, it is a type of architectural organization that starts in Persia, then is widely adopted in the Arab and Islamic world, and that for sure by this time, 13th, 14th century, it was part of an international imperial, let's say, architectural language. The same thing we can say of like the facade of the entrance building of the Selim Caravanserai, where we have like this Mukarnas niche and two bas relief with animals that Patrick Donabedian, I think, very convincingly considered among the decorations of apotropic function, so not like any let's say local or localized meaning, like they were thought also to be part elements like heraldic elements or para-heraldic elements. But I think I am convinced and I support Patrick Donabedian's interpretation. And then in like on the lunette of the entrance, there was an inscription dedicated to Ilkhan Abu Said. And this old building, I mean the entrance building, also is sponsored by Cesar Orbelian. So why do I show you these pictures? Because let's say we are in this case in Horse and in Selim on the main track of the so-called Silk Road, I mean between Lake Seban and Arpa Areni. And on this road we evidenced the use of many or mostly international architectural vocabulary. International vocabulary in the sense that we can find parallels to these structures in the Iranic world, in the Arab world, in the Seljuk caravanserais of Anatolia already from the centuries before the 14th. So like a traveler along this road, encountering the Selim caravanserai, reading the dedication in Persian, etc., would have, let's say, recorded or classified this structure as one of the many imperial service structure to long-range connectivity and trade that he or she would encounter all along Anatolia and Eastern Asia Minor and Iran, etc., etc. So this is really part of an imperial, if we want, landscape built by the Orbelian, but in shape that are, let's say, international imperial architectures. And I put here also this very famous bas relief of Amir Hassan Proshan, because we see this other very important lord, also Vayots Dzor, in a full Mongolian attire, and also riding a horse and using the bow in a way totally similar to what Mongols would do, and also is depicted with the eyes like almond eyes in a form of Eastern, like an imitation of an Eastern face, a Mongolian face. So also in this, I see more or less the same phenomenon of these Orbelians and Proshans being, of course, Armenian lords, but also on the other side, they are part of the international elites of their time. And on this point, I mentioned that Stepanos Orbelian made like two small comments about the origin of the Orbelian family, apart of the real story, so from the Orbeli of Georgia. And the second mention, the first one that was that they were connected to the Bagrati. The second mention is that they came from China. So of course, this is something that we can say, okay, it was a fake news. Yes, it's a fake news, but I see in this use of international architecture and this self-representation in Mongolian and imperial forms of the lords of Vayots Dzor, a material parallel to this statement of provenance from China of this lord. So the landscape in Yeghegis area is a landscape of interactions between the Mongols and the Orbelians. The Orbelians gained a lot, also a lot of money that they invested in family monasteries, because family monasteries were also immune and they were not subject to taxation. A connection and interaction between long-range roads and the Orbelians with the attraction of immigrant communities near one of their palaces, the one of Yeghegis, and I'm speaking of the Jewish cemetery, and also interactions between the Mongols and long-range connections that provided the need for building trade infrastructures as the Selim caravanserai. Then I'm skipping this because I think I'm already late. Just I want to finish with this picture, because if we map our sites on like we are doing, so we have like the stars that are the Orbelian palaces, the red dots that are family monasteries, fortresses in green, and caravanserais in yellow. We see that along the imperial service road, we have caravanserais, we have the of ours, while the other buildings that we have seen, so Arates and all the churches of Yeghegis and the palace of Yeghegis, are in this like side valley, the Yeghegis valley. Well, if we consider the architecture, we can see that the Orbelian representing themselves as Armenian dynasts in direct connection with Bagratid architecture, and like almost showing a quasi-royal Armenian status in the side valley of Yeghegis, where we have also a lot of local communities using those techniques that we have seen before for building like very simple structures. While on the imperial service road, they manifest themselves as imperial officers and very like a core part of the international aristocracy of their time. They do it using Persian for the inscription of Selim in dedication of Ilkhan Abu Said, but also using architectural codes and vocabulary in the Palace of Horse and also in the Caravanserai of Selim that do not connect directly to the Armenian great tradition, but mostly connect to the international imperial tradition of their time. And I hope I wasn't too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michele. Thank you, Zara. Thank you both for those excellent presentations. And we do have some questions that we will get to, and I may add in a few others as well. First question is about the name of Yeghegis. What is the meaning of the word, and what is its relation to the legend of Yeghegis, which I'm hoping you are familiar with because I am not.
I don't know what legend it's being referred to. Yeghegis literally means reeds. I mean, Yeghegik would be the nominative case. Yeghegis is the accusative case in plural. So it means a place of reeds because there are along the river banks reeds. So, I mean, it's very common that toponyms take the names of landscape features where they are. So.
Okay, clear enough. Thank you. It was another question says it was mentioned, or it may have been mentioned, that the site of Gladzor of the is not known, but in Vayots Dzor our churches and structures claim to be part of Gladzor. Can you clarify?
Yes, there is a long debate. There is a place, there's actually a village even called Gladzor, but there are different hypotheses, and none of them have been confirmed. Some have suggested it was Tanahat Monastery. Most recently, there is actually a local connoisseur who thought that this is a place not far from Yeghegis, and Karen Matevosyan, who is an art historian, the Materian, thought that this is plausible. There are different arguments for it. So it's a hypothesis. We don't know for certain, unfortunately.
Not yet. Another question asks, it reads, am I correct in thinking that until recent years, very little academic regard has been given to medieval settlement sites in Armenia beyond that of churches and monasteries and their own archaeologically destructive restorations? Can you summarize what research and literature exists on this subject? And B, is that a fair characterization, in your opinions?
I'll let the archaeologist answer.
Well, no, actually, well, it's very difficult to speak, for instance, of certain objects of medieval architecture relating to Armenia, because we have a lot of monuments, but for instance, we don't have enough residential buildings. Actually, near Yeghegis, where we have no residential buildings apart from possible residential buildings excavated by Husik Melkonian around Zorats, there is a potential other village that is Shatin, just nearby. Also, the church of Shatin is very recent, but it preserves spolia of, I think, if I'm not wrong, 11th century or 10th or 11th century. And in the area of Shatin, there can be some surviving, upstanding, ruined buildings related to a village. But in general, there's really a lack of domestic buildings in medieval Armenia. I mean, apart from those connected to monasteries. And also, this is what we see also from Dvin. In Dvin, domestic buildings have been excavated, but still we are, even us, I mean, we are still working in the citadel, and there's need maybe also to extend research in the wider urban area that has never been thoroughly investigated. So this is a lack. What I would like to add is that Vayots Dzor is very interesting from my point of view if we consider it within the so-called like medieval world system, because in this case we have a little village like Yeghegis that shows all the signs of a global hub, never becoming a city, remaining a small village. So I'm wondering, but this will be part of future research, if this happens because Dvin disappeared. Dvin was the very important global hub near our area. At a certain point, this big city disappears, and maybe this is one of the reasons why we have this creation of an international central place into a small village, which is really very interesting from my point of view. I don't know, maybe Zara is like doesn't agree.
Of course, I agree.
Thank heavens. Good. So you talk about what today you've talked about Yeghegis when it was basically at its height, shall we say. Uh, when did it become and why did it become a site of lesser importance than it was, shall we say, at its height?
So it's
I leave this to Zara,
okay.
but I think
Yeah.
that
I mean, I right now I don't have all the dates to tell you, exact dates, but so in the 1337, around that time, the Ilkhanid dynasty is going through major upheavals. It falls basically. And the international situation changes completely. So what they had, it's very interesting you asked that question. There is now in one of our next books that will come out from our project, one of the authors is discussing about the fall of Ani, and he's saying, well, Ani fell not because of Mongols, but because it was very tightly knit with a Mongol network of trade. So once the Mongols are gone, all these cities suffer because, the system is gone. So in a sense, we can say the same about Yeghegis. The system is gone. There are a lot of devastations due to Timur Lane. And the situation is not clear who is controlling what. So yeah, the Orbelians slowly lose their grip on the territory. So they become really local lords, each one in one valley and trying to kind of survive, and then their alliances don't go well. And I think I'm really sorry, I did not sort of go look. I think they ally themselves with the Chobanids, but actually the Jalaiirids win, and so yeah, the situation internationally changes, and it has an effect. That's when it starts to go down, and then it changes completely.
yeah, if I may add, really from the 12th century, from these brilliant initiatives of the bishops of Noravan that create this political space around Yeghegis, which is really the novelty, this kind of political space which is ruled by Armenians and
Noravan, sorry, not
Noravan.
Yeghegis. Noravan, which then
Noravan.
extends.
Yes, yes, sorry. Ruled by Armenians, but strictly connected to imperial power. So it's really, and it works, it breathes within the imperial space until the demise of the Ilkhans. This is in this I agree. At a certain point, the international network is not as strong, or it changes, and somehow this area it doesn't fit anymore into this global discourse.
In other words, it's gradual. It's not a sudden precipitous event that
Always.
Yes.
That's like, especially archaeology tells us, and actually, if I may, Michele, they are studying the slow abandonment of Dvin, for example. So archaeology can really show it very well that it's rarely immediate. I mean, yes, okay, Pompeii, yes, but but normally it's very slow, gradual, yeah.
Thank you. Can you talk about the origin of the Jewish community who had their cemetery here and how they came to be there, if you know, what became of them, etc.?
So this is not my personal research, so I have to give credit first to Professor Michael Stone, and who excavated there with his colleague, the late David Amid, and then Alexandra Kaffel from our team, who may be listening to us. So hello. So the inscriptions on the graves indicate that this was a rabbinic community, but most likely connected to the Persian world. So the names, some of the names that have been read, and also the title, one grave with a very, very interesting inscription, which was recorded at the beginning of the 20th century, is lost. So it's about a Sharaf ad-Din Khoja, so very Persianate. So the idea, it's very likely that this was a community of Persianate Jews. What happened to them? Now this is my hypothesis. So studying then the fall of the Orbelians and the upheavals there at the end of the 14th century, 15th, it seems like the elites, many of the elites who had connections, for example, also Grigor Tatevatsi, they moved to Georgia. Those who have connections, they moved to Georgia as kind of a safe haven. Who can, not the local poor population, but those who can actually. I think it is not unlikely that they moved to to Eastern Georgia. And it's very interesting that we start hearing about Jews in Eastern Georgia in the 14th century. There are documents. So there's no hard proof. I'm saying this as a real hypothesis, but it's possible. Or to other parts of the Timurid world. But, I mean, being a Persianate community, linguistically, they had vast possibilities of migrating, from Isfahan to Samarkand and beyond. So, but there's no hard proof. There's nothing. We don't have actually written evidence about this community. If not for the cemetery, we would have never known. And what is also interesting, I've done research on this debates or polemic between Jews and Christians in the Middle Ages. There's not a lot in Armenian, very, very little. There's nothing. There's a lot of debates against Catholics who are having huge missionary activity in Syunik in the 14th century. And there are debates with Duophysites, with the union with the Church of Rome in Cilicia, but there are no texts. Okay, there is Grigor Tatevatsi, okay, he has a chapter on the Jews and he's mainly relying on a Latin source. So we can say there is no native literature about, or even like religiously discussing what it means, what this community does, either in positive or negative way. So there is no written sources on it. It's very interesting.
Thank you. Okay. Complicated but interesting question. Is there evidence of craftsmen inscribing multiple layers of power, local, regional, etc., onto a single monument? For example, is the inscription to Abu Sa'id Ilkhan the only dedication on the Selim Caravanserai, or does it share space with the Broshians or Belians, etc.?
Well, no, that is a perfect case, because in Selim Caravanserai, like in the building that hosts the entrance, on the outside there's a Persian inscription dedicated to Ilkhan Abu Sa'id, but on the inside there is a smaller inscription of Cesar Orbelian in Armenian and his family. So, like, the two inscriptions in a way cater to different audiences, to different segments, because, like, for the general public and seen from the outside, Selim is totally in line with the most advanced service road inns that you could find on the Silk Roads, let's say, and so it's totally like an imperial architecture, transnational. But for an Armenian able to read, on the inside, like somebody who could read Armenian could be informed that they were into like a political space run by an Armenian dynasty. But the two inscriptions are not, let's say, at the same level. One is in the front, is totally public. The other is on part of the vault, etc., etc. And another case comes from Arates, which is more connected to the let's say the relation of, between Proshans and Orbelians, because there's a Proshan inscription that is put on the face of the Bagrati 11th century church. And when the Orbelian take control of the monastery, they don't obliterate it, but totally hide it, building a huge Zara, help me with the word. I don't remember.
Gavit? Gavit?
A huge gavit in front of it with inscriptions of the Orbelians. So this type of multiple entities and authorities that sometimes challenge each other, sometimes put each other into like a hierarchy, is quite, I wouldn't say common, but we encountered it several times in important public buildings.
Very good. Another question. First, thanking you for your amazing presentation and outstanding work. And the question is, can we thus state that the Armenian Orbelian dynasty was founded by a woman, a local princess belonging to the Sunnic dynasty? Question mark.
No, not really. I hope I didn't imply that. You do need a man and a woman to found a dynasty and have a progeny, at least in those times. So we can say that the Orbelians found their local connections through a woman, which is not exceptional. You know, it happened a lot, especially when there were dynastic change and new men who came in a region and wanted to legitimize their rule. They usually would find their connection to the land through marriage to a local woman. And this happened also across religious lines, by the way, not just, you know, like, or Muslims who conquer Armenia and then marry Armenian princesses as a way of finding a connection and legitimizing their rule and having a local network of support. So that I would say. And we don't know that if this woman was a Sunni. Probably not. She was the sister of a bishop. So an elite, probably a new elite. You know, we need to connect this also to what Michele again emphasized, the role of Noravank, how it became a very unique space of bishop elites. So, you know, and actually it's very funny. Stepanos Orbelian says, oh, you know, there were no suitable women for him to marry, no suitable elite, like princely women. So he had to marry a sister of a bishop, which was not exactly the kind of elite they were looking for, but okay, they had to settle for that because it was the best they could get in the situation. So yeah, I wish I could say that the Orbelian founder was a woman, but even the fact that they keep their name connected to their origin in Georgia, this fortress of Orbet, you know, then they obviously intermarry, they are perceived as local dynasts, you know, but yeah. I can't say that there is she was a matriarch, but she was the local link to Sunnic.
Okay, fair enough. Let us stop there then, and let me thank you both for your wonderful presentations and for the publication, which again I put in the chat the link to the page on the Brepol's website where you can access the free PDF. And again, you can also find the book for purchase. So once again, thank you both Zara and Michele for your work. Thank you to the Society for Armenian Studies for partnering with NAASR on this excellent program. And of course, thank you to the audience for joining us and for your interesting and informative questions. Any last words from either of you?
Just thank you very much for having
Yeah.
us.
Thank you very, very much.
Very